Scott, welcome to the Holy Post. We're grateful to have you with us.
I'm glad to be with you, Skye.
Okay, so some of our listeners are going to be familiar a little bit with World Relief. We've had Matt Sorens on a couple of times, but what triggered wanting to get you on is that you and the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals, took out a full-page ad recently in the Washington Post. Tell us a little bit about why you did that, what was the ad about, and how does it relate to where we are right now as a church in the United States?
Be glad to do that, Skye. It really came out of some personal concerns that many of us who were in the leadership of both World Relief and the NAE were having. And that included conversations with people that were in positions of leadership with other relief and development agencies, seminary presidents, Bible college presidents, and all the rest of it. And we were just having this deep sense that the evangelical faith was being very narrowly defined in the marketplace broadly, if you will, that the voices that were being most often sought and amplified were voices that were giving a very narrow interpretation of our evangelical faith, really focusing on one or two issues as opposed to the broad set of commands that Christ gave to us to live out this gospel that is good news at every level of human existence. So we saw it being very narrowly defined, but we also saw it being misrepresented in a variety of places. For example, as you know, we work closely with refugees and have been in a terrific private-public partnership with the State Department for about 40 years, resettling refugees. And with the State Department as our partner, we've resettled nearly 300,000 refugees over that time. And we know the dignity of their lives. We know their entrepreneurship. We also know the trauma. And we know that so many of them were persecuted Christians, but we welcomed all that the State Department allocated to us. And they were being represented by some of these same evangelical voices in ways that were so demeaning to who they were as people. And they were robbing them of their dignity and of their place. And they were misrepresenting them as being this terribly dangerous group of people. That wasn't only for refugees. If you think of Waltersdorf quartet of the vulnerable, the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the immigrant, and the refugee, and add to that the poor as a whole, and there was so much conversation that seemed to be attacking those populations, less so certainly the widow and the orphan. But as we looked at that, we thought, we need to get another counter narrative out. And a lot of people of color in particular, but also a lot of other evangelical Christians came to us and said, isn't there some way that we can have a voice because we feel like ours has been taken away? So we listened carefully to that and we said, we think we can do that responsibly. And we wrote a statement that is founded on For the Health of the Nation. It's a standing document by the NAE, written in 2004, updated just recently, representing a broader, more comprehensive view of this gospel that we as evangelicals have given our lives to. And so our desire was to be able to create a dialogue and a conversation among evangelicals to say, do we need to have a broader view of this gospel that is humble, that is thoughtful, that is broadly biblical? Our goal was to be both pastoral and prophetic, and to be timely to the times, but also rooted in the scriptures. And so that's the statement we put in, and we asked people to sign on to it. And we've got about 2,000 various evangelical leaders who have signed on to date from a lot of different constituencies. And most often what we're hearing is gratitude. Hey, thanks for giving us a chance to take a different posture than what we're hearing out there.
And I'm grateful for that as well. You mentioned not having a platform, not feeling heard, that there are evangelical voices right now that are being platformed in the media and certainly by this current administration, which I would say probably wouldn't agree with the document that the NAE has created that stands by For the Health of the Nation, because it is such a broad vision of what Christian cultural engagement really looks like and a faithfulness to the gospel looks like. What do you have to say to those voices that seem to have eclipsed historic evangelicalism in our culture today? What do we do with that?
It's interesting. I think the best thing is to, as we're able, engage people in conversation as opposed to debate, and to lead with questions as opposed to attacks. But I think, as is so often the case, Tim Keller is helpful on this. One of the things he's done is he's looked at the broad narrative of Scripture. He says, there are really 4 places where there are key ethical themes for us to follow. He said there's racial justice, there's poverty and marginalization, there's sanctity of life, and there's sexual purity. He said those 4 just arise out of the Scriptures regularly. He said what's interesting is that 2 of those align to a conservative agenda and 2 of those align to a liberal agenda. And when you think about that, you have to recognize that no one agenda encompasses the totality of the biblical narrative and the biblical call. So what we've been hoping in this is that we could begin a dialogue to say, come, let us reason together. Let's look at the fullness of the biblical call. Let's make room for one another in this dialogue without capitulating on our belief in the Scriptures as our guide for our practice and our belief, our orthodoxy and our orthopraxis. At the same point, we've got to recognize that we've gotten really narrow in some of our beliefs. And actually, our political agenda drives more of our dialogue than our biblical agenda does.
That's a theme that reoccurs on this podcast a lot. So it's you don't have to sell it to us by any means. We see it all the time. You mentioned when we were talking about the full page ad that you and the National Association of Evangelicals took out in the Washington Post and the thousands of evangelical leaders who signed on in support of that. How do you reconcile the gap that exists between the thousands of evangelical leaders who clearly and theologically support what World Relief is doing and what surveys are saying about the evangelicals who are sitting in the church pews, that many of them do not support the resettlement of refugees. They do not support the immigration policies that have existed in the United States. They do feel threatened, particularly by non-white immigrants coming into the country. What do we do about that gap between the leaders and the people, where we need the support and the financial backing of the people in order to keep this good work happening?
Yeah, it's a great question, Skye. Let me give you 2 thoughts on that. There is a gap between many pastors and their congregations on this. And that gap would appear to be widening. I think the first reason would be the lens through which we look at the question. So for many pastors who have spent a long time studying the Scriptures, they know that the biblical call to the orphan, the widow, the immigrant, the refugee, the stranger is so deeply rooted in the Scriptures. And in fact, if you take a look at the Old Testament, there is no greater call, no call often mentioned more often than the care for the refugee and the immigrant, except for there is one Lord, your God, and you shall worship no other. And so they know that narrative. They know God's preferential heart for the poor and the marginalized, and they live out of that and they seek to speak out of that. So their lens is different. For many in the congregations, their first lens actually is their socioeconomic and political lens. So if you think, for example, of a funnel by which we get our information, for many people, the top end of that funnel is a 24/7 news cycle, whatever source that happens to be. And for some, it's MSNBC and they have one point of view. For another, it's Fox, they have another point of view. But if that is the top of our funnel, and then it comes down to, okay, beyond that political, then I have a sociological, I have an economic view. And way down here, I remember a Bible verse or 2 about this. And my pastor once said something 3 years ago in a sermon that I really can't remember. So I think that the first question is, what is the lens we're using? Our goal has been to try to flip that model and say, let's look at this first biblically. Then let's look at it humanly. How would we want to be treated if, in fact, the experience of the asylum seeker that is seeking to flee violence in the Northern Triangle, or the refugee, a persecuted Christian, or a persecuted person of no faith, if we were that person, how would we want to be treated? So biblical, then human.
That's also very biblical, though, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah, Jesus said something about that.
I think he did, yeah.
And then social and economic and political matter. but they should not be the driver. So I think that's the first reason why there's this gap. I think the second one is in the quality of information that we get.
Hmm.
If the information we get is basically telling us that immigrants and refugees are very, very dangerous people, we're going to be fearful. I had a conversation in the White House with one of Mike, Vice President Pence's staff, and we were talking about this, and he's a faithful believer. And I said, I'm having some difficulty understanding, and maybe you can help me explain to the 1,000+ churches that we're working with in the US, why is this picture painted of the refugee population being so dangerous? I said, because the reality is, and these are State Department figures, of 3 million refugees resettled since the Refugee Act took place in 1980, not a single American has lost their life to a terror act sponsored by a refugee. 3 million and zero. You're not going to find 3 million people named Scott or Leonard or Dave or Linda that is safer than that population. In fact, they estimated, the Cato Institute estimated that any single American's chance of being killed in a terror attack by a refugee was 1 in 3.64 billion, which is about the same chance that on your drive to the hardware store, you're going to both win the lottery and get killed by a stray golf ball. It is infinitesimally small. They are the most vetted group of people. If you're a terrorist and you want to get in the US, the last thing you want to do is go through 18 to 24 months of vetting. So when you look at that information, most Americans don't have access to that.
Yeah, but most fears aren't rational to begin with, right? Because that doesn't work. Fear is irrational most often, and it's a very effective political tool. So it's far easier to say that person or that group of people looks different than you, believes differently than you, has different customs and practices than you, and they're obviously therefore a threat. That's kind of a visceral, basic, fear-based appeal, which is so powerful in so many communities. So I applaud you for wanting to bring facts into the light so that people can see them. But I sometimes I'm concerned that the fear is just so powerful that facts, they're bringing a knife to a gunfight. In our time remaining, let's talk about the current situation and how some of the policies that the government is now activating have impeded the work of World Relief. And especially, how is this current election kind of shaping up? 2 years ago in 2018, during the midterms, immigration was a big topic. Right now, I'm not hearing anything about it. I'm not hearing about refugees. I'm not hearing about the southern border. I'm not hearing any of that stuff because everything's eclipsed by coronavirus and other issues. What do Christians need to know right now before they begin the process of voting that maybe they're not hearing?
Skye, there are so many things that as believers we should be paying attention to with regard to this election season, and more broadly, just because it's right for us to live in our lives in faithfulness. But I want to start in one place. It has to do with our identity as believers. I'm concerned for us as Christians that we have come to think that politics is the ultimate thing. And there's a certain idolatry in that. We think that if our party wins, that somehow we will enjoy this wonderful path ahead. If our party loses, it's all over, as though there wasn't a sovereign God under which we live our lives. So I think there's a risk of an idolatrous view of politics that we should be careful about. And so that would be one of my first concerns, because whether you're Republican or Democrat, in the seeking of power, we may actually erode the very power of the faith that we proclaim. And in gaining the power, we may become more dependent upon that and less dependent on the Christ who empowers our lives for the godliness that we're called to. So that's one thing I would just say broadly. Now, I know that you guys have been talking about race on the podcast, and I think that is a terrifically important issue. We ought to be asking, how do we elevate our national character? How do we elevate our national conversation in such a way that we honor the Imago Dei, the image of God in every person? Our policies ought to be seeking the flourishing of all people. And if it's very narrowly defined, I think we're not being consistent with the gospel call. And so I think we have to broaden our view of what does it mean for people to flourish. That's why in the For the Health of the Nation, we list 8 different things, everything from the notion of the sanctity of life to creation care, to racial reconciliation. My call would be for all of us as believers to embrace the whole counsel of God. Now, because we work with the population of refugees, and you asked about that specifically in the administration policies, that's a real concern to us. And it should be for many Christians as well, particularly with regard to persecuted Christians. There was a stated policy by both President Trump and Vice President Pence that we are going to do more for persecuted Christians. We're going to serve them better. The reality is that the number of persecuted Christians that have been allowed into the country under the current administration from countries like Iran and Iraq with the greatest persecution of believers has fallen over 90% in both of those cases. The number of persecuted Christians being allowed in the country has been dramatically slashed, despite the promises. And we've published, along with Open Doors, a report that can be found on our World Relief website that details from each of the countries what is happening. Now, we're convinced that as Americans, we've had a terrific history of recognizing the trauma of the refugee and embracing not only persecuted Christians, but persecuted people of other faith or no faith at all. But for believers who really care about their brothers and sisters around the world who are undergoing tremendous persecution, I think that's an issue we ought to be calling whatever administration is in place to pay attention to.
Agreed, absolutely. What have you heard anything coming out of either campaign leading up to this election about a change in policy, regardless of who wins? Is the Trump administration saying they'll do anything in a second term? Is the Biden camp saying that they would lift these numbers? What have you heard?
Yes, as you may know, the average presidential determination, which is what sets the number of refugees that are allowed into the country, has averaged about 85,000 over the course of history. It has fallen each year under President Trump too. Now they've declared that for 2021 to be 15,000. And because they're dismantling the whole process by which refugees are vetted and allowed in, it's very possible that they could look at 15,000 and say, well, sorry, we couldn't do it because we dismantled the processes by which it takes place. On the other side of that, Vice President Biden has made a declaration that his intent would be to lift that cap, to return it to normalcy, and in time get to 120 to 150,000 refugees. Now, let's put that in perspective for just a moment. There are 80 million displaced people in the world. 26 million are refugees. There are 260 million persecuted Christians in the world. So when we're talking about the possibility of 120 to 150,000 who can still be very, very carefully vetted, we're not going to solve the global problem by doing that. But I think it's not only important for us keeping our promise and our history and our national character, keeping our promises to those who aided us in our military in Iraq and Iran, where we've broken the promise to bring them in, but it also impacts our ability to lead the world in this, because when America leads, other countries open up their generosity. But right now, Canada, at 1/10 of our population, is resettling more refugees than the United States is. And our position has been national security is a very appropriate administration prerogative, and it's a responsibility. But compassion and national security do not have to be held as binary and mutually exclusive. We can do both. We've done both for many years, and we believe we should return to that.
Wow. Scott, the United States should be a moral leader in the world. And within the United States, the church should be its moral leader. And it feels like, sadly, we have let both of those responsibilities fall. And I'm grateful for leaders like you and others who are reminding us of that call and who are working even with the resources and limitations that are currently on you to do what's right and do what's best. But I do hope that in the coming years, we can see more more evangelicals stand up and say, we care about the least and the forgotten, the refugee, the persecuted Christian brother or sister, and meet this need, even if it can't be addressed 100%. There's a lot more we can do, more we've done in the past and more we can do in the future. So we're very grateful for that reminder. One last time before we wrap up, what resources would you point our audience to? You mentioned the Evangelical Immigration Table, where they can get those that walk through scripture on what the Lord says about this issue. Where can people find the Health of the Nation document that's been put out by the NAE?
If they go to forthehealthofthenation.net, or they go to the NAE website or World Relief website, they can find access to it.
I think that it's not a long document. I think that would be a really useful thing for everyone to look at and read through as they contemplate their vote. As you put earlier, there is no political party that has a monopoly on any of these virtues. So it isn't like you walk away from it and you're clearly going to vote one way or another. But I think it will give folks a framework, historical, theological framework for thinking Christianly about their responsibility as a citizen.
Yes, and the goal again is to be pastoral and prophetic, not partisan. If I can offer one thing on that point, Skye, for those who are concerned, is this all about being political? It's a fair question, but we should define our terms. If by political, people ask that question, meaning, is World Relief or the NAE becoming partisan? Are you going to support a party or candidate? The answer is clearly no. We have not, we will not. But if you allow me to define politics as the art of public policy, our calling as followers of Jesus does not excuse us from that conversation. In fact, it demands that we're in it, because we should be working for the flourishing of all people. So our call is that we would be policy oriented, because our gospel is the richest way to inform that policy. And to your point, the church ought to be in the lead on that. Let's step up to our calling. Let's live out that grace and truth of Christ. And it will challenge both political parties, and it will challenge us, and the nation will be richer for it.
Amen. And just, there are so many issues that we as Christians and as churches can engage in without having to deal with the government. But when it comes to refugees and immigration policy, there is no way for us to engage those without engaging the federal government. So it's a necessity of our love for our neighbor that we have to engage in these policy issues. And that means sometimes getting quote unquote political while we remain nonpartisan. So thank you for taking that on at a time when it's as difficult as ever. And thank you for your input to our audience. And again, go to forthehealthofthenations.net, go to the evangelical immigration table.com, .net. You'll figure it out. Google it.
.org and,
Google it.
and worldrelief.org.
And worldrelief.org. Scott, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure, Skye.